I want to ask you guys two questions, all of you. And just briefly, on Monday's class, they showed in the search fund note, I think you guys have seen it, the distribution of returns. And I mentioned earlier that wasn't my experience as an investor. If you could just go down the line and answer two questions. One, what % of the search funds you invest in do you think get a deal done? What % of those deals do you do? And what % of those deals work out? And I'll start with myself. My own experience is about 3/4 of the people who start a search fund find a deal. It's been down a little bit in the last 2 years. About 3/4 of those deals I do, and about 90+% of them have a reasonable return on capital. So that's my own experience. Bob?
See, I haven't thought of that in terms of percentages. Probably a half a dozen deals, searches over the last 23 years or so, never concluded, never found a company. I bet I've turned down 25%, maybe more, in terms of the deal. We've conclusively demonstrated that we know how to kill companies. Done that a couple different times. In fact, Jim and I did one together. But most, in general, they all produce good, decent returns. I mean, I know there's a lot of focus on IRRs. I just, if I start out with this and I end up with this and this one's bigger, I usually figure it's a good deal. And most of them have been that way.
Jim, what would be your three numbers?
75%, 75%, and 75%.
I'd say we probably 80%. We probably only invest in half the deals that are brought to us, and there are all sorts of reasons that we turn them down, and then probably 80%. 80% have worked out well.
So that's a pretty different distribution than in the search fund note, and you probably have 65% of the data points or 50% of the data points represented in this room. So there must be something that is pushing people to the left. So, yeah. Sorry. That's your question. And which of the three deals did you guys support?
I didn't support any of them.
Okay.
What I would have told the searchers is that I think these are three true believer specialty consumer market deals. If they wanted to do the green one, the fertilizer or toys, I could put them in touch with people who knew something about that, because I don't know anything about consumer products per se. I could be talked into the veterinary business, and I thought it had critical due diligence questions that you really could answer. In the other two businesses you couldn't. So I would have said, shut it down. You played the game well, but sorry.
I love the toy business. I think this is a great company. It's really not toys. It's nostalgia products for parents and grandparents to buy. Give it to the kid plays with it once or twice, and it sits over by the Christmas tree, and they feel good about having bought it. It's got a premium price. The manufacturing process can't be that complicated. You could outsource it. There's little or no IP content here. All you really have to, and the sales force is only paid in cash after they sell the product, probably after they collect the money. So it's a legal classic pyramid structure like Amway or any other company you've heard
Remember,
about.
he was an insurance salesman.
And I can just see. I don't think that Marks and Spence, not Marks and Spence, but Marks and Church. should try to manage the sales force. I think they should go conduct a methodical search with a paid headhunter and find somebody who's probably older and has done this and been very successful in some successful marketing structure similar to this. I think that the IRRs, I think they're underestimating the potential of this business. I just think that with a little help from somebody who an investor perhaps that's sees this thing as a more attractive opportunity, they can get the IRRs up into the range where investors will get excited. Very simple company to operate.
Well,
I would start with just thinking about the seller. And in our experience, the seller is absolutely critical. Less integral to the business, so not involved terribly much in customer relationships, not involved in critical functions. One of the big problems I saw with the toy business was she runs product development. Product development toy companies are all about product development. So if she goes AWOL on you, you're toast. And that they not be terribly they're going to be involved with the people, but you don't want the people to be loyal to them. You want them to be loyal to the company and the like. Second, that the seller be available. Third, that the seller be willing to leave capital at risk. Fourth, that the seller have a really good reason for selling. Fifth, that they have reasonable expectations. And I wasn't enthralled with the expectations of either of the first two companies, the fertilizer business or the toy company. They both seemed like they were starting out fairly high, and they were people. I guess the last thing was they were a little more emotional or creative than rational. And I think having a seller, it is an incredibly complex process to buy a company, and you're going to have to talk through a lot of issues. And if you have people who have outsized expectations at the beginning, and may not reason things terribly clearly, that's a warning sign. So at the end of the day, I came down on American Veterinary. I like the industry growth, 6 to 9%, relatively recession-proof, fragmented industry. In terms of the company, good reputation for service and low turnover in the personnel. That's always a big issue. I suspect it's at a point of inflection in terms of the corporate staff. They have a big corporate team, and if you do succeed in driving revenues after that, you may find that the operating leverage is very high. I like the seller situation. It was a guy in his 60s. It didn't sound like he was going to be leaving anywhere. We think someone who's going to disappear the day after the sale is fatal to us. Seller, the relative growth avenues, adding services. I think, JJ, you focused on that, sort of expanding the service offering. Visit declines we were worried about, or I was worried about, but I concluded that if the industry's growing, that's probably more an execution issue than it is an industry issue, and something that should be solvable. Financial systems was a real concern, but it may also be an opportunity. You have to figure out whether you can get them in place. Once you understand how the different 15 locations are doing, you may find that one's doing something really well that you can roll out to the other location. And so those are big red flags, but things that we could probably get through in diligence. So I thought the problems I saw with the other businesses, much harder to address through due diligence. These ones were things that you could ultimately understand through your diligence and figure out whether you could deal with the risks or not.
Thanks. So I think it's less important which companies the three of these investors wanted to back, and more insights into how they think about companies and what goes on inside their heads.
Now, if Jim had brought me the toy deal, by God, I would have listened, because that enthusiasm. Now I'm not being funny. That enthusiasm and passion and thoughtfulness about it really struck me. I probably would have turned him down in the end, but it would definitely have gotten my attention, because he thought it through and grabbed onto something, and that's critical.
So obviously that passion and how it's presented matters. Sonia.
I had a question about something that I think hasn't come up yet, which we didn't discuss, is liability exposure. And for me, that also made the third deal is somewhat more attractive, because choking hazard in toys. Besides that, but it obviously also hinted in the fertilizer a little bit in the end that, there
Choking
may be
on
something.
fertilizer?
No, that was the toy business. Put a sticker on those, fine. But in the second business with the fertilizer, in the end, it's hinting a little bit at potential liability exposure. And if I'm running my search fund, I obviously can't afford Simpson Thatcher. And in terms of potential liability exposure, what I meant to ask you earlier, how do you find a great lawyer? And also, how do you go about something that's so hard to quantify in these two cases?
Which one of you would like to take that? Joe?
Well, the fertilizer business, I worried a little bit about the things you brought up. I felt like that on many dimensions that's a very poor fit. The business is a very poor fit with for an inexperienced search fund entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial team. You've got there is some legal risk when you hear that Hunter well, Hunter scares me when I hear that he doesn't like to see the bosses coming around his shop, his lab. But more importantly, to scale this company, you've got to triple the infrastructure. You've got to go to 3 labs from 1, 6 plants from 2, 6 warehouses from 2. And you got 2 years to do that. And that's a tall order for people who have never run a company before. So
Finding
really
a
answer your
lawyer,
question.
finding a lawyer, that's pretty easy to do. I mean, through your network and so forth. But one of the issues here, this is really a startup company that's a few years old.
Yeah.
And one of the big mysteries of startups, especially if you get early traction with revenue, you just can't tell if that's low-hanging fruit or if that's really indicative of the marketplace. And one of the things that struck me about this, I mean, you know, organic fertilizers have been around for years, and the people that are buying them are willing to pay the price, the premium price, are really true believers. And it's hard to figure out if they're indicative of a big true believer market. And that was the thing that really turned me. And plus, you know, going back to what I said, you know, so if there's somebody in the company who you're critically dependent upon, this guy, the chemist or whatever he is, and he can't be managed, man, you're toast if you as a new
We're
entrepreneur.
going to talk about lawyers in class 4 for legal issues, including finding great lawyers. Anything you guys want to say about that, be welcome, since you won't be here then, and we'll dive into it in more detail.
I'll throw in my 2 cents, which is that a good lawyer is really hard to find. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I think especially a great lawyer is very hard to find. But within your investor group, it's just, as Bob alluded to, it's a perfect use of your investor group to network into a good lawyer. And the second part of your question about product liability, I believe that there are certain risks that look scary on the front end but are insurable. And I think that feels to me like an insurable risk. So. Andy?
I just want to follow up on Joe's question from earlier and get your guys' perspectives on what you think about roll-ups as a search fund strategy.
They're really, really hard. And the time to do a roll-up is when you're clearly at the point where you're running the company and it's not running you, and it takes you a couple of years to get to that point. And you've got a culture and a system and a methodology into which you're merging something, so that the new companies that you're buying are not going to be changing the culture and the style of your company. But even with that, there are so many things to consider in roll-ups that I'm not real enthusiastic about going into a company where the roll-up strategy is sort of pivotal to its long-term success. That's my own personal view.
Yeah, I think you know, in the American Veterinary deal, you're going to have $13.5 million tied up in a bunch of stores that don't have any organic sales growth, and so the investment thesis is to go out and buy more stores that don't have any organic sales growth. If you can't get these stores to grow that you got, I don't see how you're going to make a return on this investment by putting more money to work in non-growing stores. I also think that you're going to pay more for the stores you buy than it would cost to open them by a huge margin. But you are getting some EBITDA, but it's not growing. So I think I'd probably look at opening new stores and see if I could make some money. If you made me do that deal, I would look at opening my own new stores.
That's a classic make-buy decision.
I would just add
Peter
one
can talk
other
to that.
thing about roll-ups is that some industries are fragmented for a reason, and on paper it looks good, but really understand if it's an industry. Here's what I would say: if it's an industry that has been around a long time and is still fragmented,
Better know why.
there's probably a reason it's still fragmented. Yeah.
The one other thing about roll-ups, and I spent a fair amount of time doing them with Brentwood Associates, and one of our most successful investments is a roll-up. But one of the real issues,
What industry was that?
gosh, we run golf courses, trade magazines, number of courses, and right now we've got a company that's in methadone clinics. But one of the real issues is the management complexity, because if you, and it's probably one of the bigger negatives to me about American Vet, but I think it's overcomable. But you have 15 locations that probably the top paid person who's your P&L manager is making $50,000. That doesn't have a lot of education, doesn't have real management experience, that they've kind of grown up through the ranks, and that person is, that's your front line. That's your frontline P&L manager. We had this problem in spades in the golf course business, and you can set up all sorts of fancy incentive structures. They don't. We gave them all equity. They didn't understand what equity meant until the day they cashed the check, and it was. I mean, it worked out splendidly, but not. It was almost despite that issue, not because of it. It's tough.
Yeah. So I really like the fertilizer deal, and I think our pitching now, which obviously there's a lot of risk, but I think I can see a path to this being a 30 times deal. I can see that. How attractive of a pitch would that be if maybe not this company, but a really high risk, high return deal in general for a search fund? Obviously it's not a typical deal, but is that something you would ever consider, or is that pretty much you strike off the bat? Just I'm looking for.
I'd probably turn it down just because it's a specialty consumer deal. I just don't know. I mean, every time I've done something like that, I've lost money, which would tell you and me that I don't know anything about it, and I can't bring anything to the table besides money. I could probably introduce you to some people who could. So if you had a group of, as in the toy case, if you had a group of investors who really understood that business and could figure out how to help you be successful, that's what you want. But I just wouldn't be that person.
We have a much harder time with high growth or really high risk, really high reward situations. We're not venture capitalists. We're buyout guys, and much more focused on, get a good business that you have high confidence you're going to make some money on, and then hopefully the way you make a lot of money on it is by getting it into an adjacent industry that really where you can get that growth, but with relatively low risk.
Robert? I want to touch on the sourcing aspect of what you guys talked about, proprietary versus the broker angle. When you are working on those proprietary deals and you're making a lot of phone calls, going to conferences, I guess in my experience, when you talk to some of those entrepreneurs or family-owned businesses, you say, "Are you interested in selling?" Most of them will say, "Yeah, at the right price, of course." But what's the strategy, or in your experience, what's been the most successful strategy in determining, who actually is realistic and getting down to it? Because a lot of times it seems like they're willing to have a conversation. You could spin your wheels for a while, and I guess what are the tactics that you guys have seen that have worked the best in approaching those angles?
May I take a step? So just to be clear, I don't make that many phone calls. And,
Well, no.
and every one of them that I make gets answered by the person that I want to talk to. That is my whole purpose in life when I'm searching, because I've done it. I've knocked on doors, door to door, selling life insurance, and I hated it. I've made 100 calls a day, and I hated it. And so I want to have these warm introductions where, hey, so Joe Schmo, and we talk about their fishing trips and all that kind of stuff. So it's a much more pleasant search, but there's a lot of time between those calls, so you got to do something. So you might as well look at opportunistic deal flow coming in over the transom.
Does that answer your question?
Qualifying sellers is an art. It's not a science, and there are all kinds of things that you can look at. I don't have a laundry list of if you do these 10 things, you're home free. I mean, first of all, if the seller's old, it's better than if they're young. If they got kids who have nothing to do with the business, it's better than if they have a son or a daughter who's already in the business. If you can get the wife or the spouse to know how much money is involved and they think about spending it, that's good. If the seller is willing to immediately introduce you to his employees as the potential new owner, maybe that comes down longer. If they're willing to let you talk to their customers, all of those things are kind of signs that they're serious. If the amount of money involved, if you know enough about their personal financial circumstances to suggest that the amount of money involved is something they really can live with. You're going to run across a lot of businesses. A $10 million business, the entrepreneur is taking a couple of $1 million out a year, and he's going to get $8 million in cash. That ain't going to work. No way you can invest $8 million after taxes and make $2 million a year. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of things like that. You sort of need to get your arms around when it comes to figuring out if the person who's going to sell is real.
I think this part, or this issue of qualifying the seller is really critical, because in a search fund, your biggest enemy is time. Every month that ticks by is one less month that you have to do your search. And it is easy to burn 9 months on a deal, which is a huge chunk of your search fund, when in the end, the guy was never going to sell, or was never going to sell under terms that were reasonable to you. And it's funny, you got to chuckle when he said get the people to spend their money, but when I bought my first company, a guy that was an advisor to me, who was very deal savvy, and he ended up being our attorney, but he wasn't an investor. And he said, the seller's name was George, he said, get George and Carla, his wife, to start spending the money in their head. And I did. And I asked him, so what are you going to do afterwards? And they talk about buying this ranch and that ranch. And what happened is I could see that they had moved on, that he was actually in a different place, and he wanted to get to that place mentally. And that convinced me that, in fact, he was a seller.
Just add one quick point, and that is, it's been years since I've seen this survey, but typically when you ask somebody, who are you, they answer by giving you their title and the company they work for, which is the wrong answer. In most sellers are intimately identified with their company. And so you're trying to figure out just what David said, that they're willing to separate. And I've seen, I can think of 3 deals that busted at the very end because the seller just couldn't, in the end, imagine themselves not running that company. And that's what you got to figure out as quickly as you possibly can so you don't waste time.
So I comment on that. We had a deal that was a great deal. Remember the construction equipment rental company?
I do.
And it came back twice, and it was so close, and it was really a good deal. And what happened is the guy ended up redoing projections. He was half out the door, he redid projections and said, I can do this, will be great, I'm going to do this. And what we could have done is just parallel processed along the way, so that, we shouldn't have just ignored him, because he might have sold, but we should have really had plan B, bubbling on the back burner right away. And it's an art, but it should be fun.
If you don't leave that, I'd go see, because I don't make many calls. I can afford to go see everybody that I get in contact with. If I don't leave that first meeting with a pledge from him to send me his financials, and he or she having given me some broad range of what their EBITDA is and the number of employees and that kind of stuff, if not hand me the financials on the way out the door, then I really don't take that much further, because there's really not anything to discuss. I know so many searchers that have spent 9 months courting sellers who never get to first base with them.
Gus?
So, as investors, I wanted to understand how you think about the sort of life cycle of the search funds as, you're talking about presenting search funds that you don't fund the actual acquisition for, and how do you think about both sort of from an investor's perspective, the commitment you're making, and how you have that conversation with the searcher when you invest in them initially, because it's obviously very challenging for the searcher to have a company and have to fill holes from investors who, for whatever reason, decided not to participate. So I guess that's from the searcher's perspective, and from the seller's perspective, I would think a recent business school grad going around saying, I have these people who will give me money in the future. What role do you play in the selling, in the acquisition process to make the seller confident that there's actually people standing behind the searcher?
We have a couple of times been asked to go out. One time we were asked to go out and visit with a seller. Number of times talk with a seller to give them comfort that we were serious. We never say we're going to back the person in whatever the deal is. That would be nonsense. We don't know what the deal, the transaction, the company, et cetera. But of the numbers, I think we turn down the most deals that are presented to us. And it isn't that we just say no, goodbye. we have usually, along the way, tried to say, here are our issues. If you can address these and or diligence them and mitigate the risks, we're going to take a hard look. But, so we'll try and give the searcher a lot of questions about what is it that would make it a good deal or a bad deal to us, or good investment or bad investment, and try so that they're not rarely is someone surprised by what our response. We've telegraphed it along the way by the questions, and if they can answer them, we're all ears. If they can't,
That's why we've got to maintain good relationships with your investors and keep them apprised all the way along. Don't surprise them at the end of the deal. But in the real world today, you're going to have a gap. The banks aren't where they used to be, so you've got a problem there for all kinds of reasons. I mean, 20 years ago, I could say with absolute confidence, any deal I was involved in, you could get it done with the investors around the table. There was enough debt financing available, the markets were a lot different. Today, that's not true. So I think it's a matter of having good communications with your investors. I talk to sellers on a regular basis on this issue to convince them that, that this particular entrepreneur has a very smart group of investors who know how to get these things done. And if the due diligence proceeds properly, as you just mentioned, that will be there.
What is your attitude towards deals where a key hire is required, and where the search team is basically saying, look, I need to spend 10% of EBITDA on this person who is going to run an aspect of the business for me? For example, that you mentioned in the toy case. What's your general attitude towards that?
Well, if that hire is going to be made right away, in the calculation of the EBITDA multiple, I like to see that person's salary in the EBITDA that calculates the multiple. And then if it's a small company and that takes EBITDA from $1 million down to $750,000, and we're now paying 14 times EBITDA, I don't like that. If it's $2 million and it takes it down 10%, then that looks different cosmetically and substantively.
I might add to that it depends. Because if you're buying a company where a lot of things are lining up and you need a key hire, but everything else is lining up pretty well, that might be something to be okay. If on the other hand, this isn't one of about 8 things that have to get done in order for this deal to work out, then I would be less likely to do it. So I would just put it in the basket of operational risk that you're taking, or execution risk.
I would say the other thing is it just depends what the position is. If you're trying to hire a CFO, we would be a lot more sympathetic to that than if you're trying to hire someone to replace the product development person at the toy company. That we would worry a lot about. It just depends how mission central it is.
This side? Yeah, Alex?
So I think across the board, 75 to 90%, or 80 to 90% of your investments are success, but we have the report saying that it's more. I'm wondering what's going on there, what's all there, and talk a little bit about.
We're smart.
Well, talk about if the number areas in the report, if these are random search funds going on, of people in the Midwest that don't know what's going on, but they're search funds. You guys really have a selection skill, and this is a bias going on. So you guys really do a great job choosing to fund the right ones.
Either that or we do a great job of culling out the ones that are least likely to succeed and work out. And those are two different things. You really just never know what you've invested in is going to work out, are going to be the winner. And so, but it's pretty easy to spot the dogs, I think.
Well, excuse me, if I can jump in. Why don't we take these in 2 chunks? Let's talk first about the ability, if there is an ability, to spot a successful searcher when they're raising their search fund. And then we'll go to the issue of when they actually buy a company. And I'll begin with, I'm sort of in Jim's camp. I think it's really hard anymore to identify after a meeting or 2 whether someone's going to be successful. But there are 6 questions that I ask, and I bet the panelists have their own 6 questions that allow me to weed out some obvious problems. Bob, just on the issue of the search fund now.
Yeah, it's one of the mysteries and thrills of doing this, because I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I can think of some people who are, you know, if I invest, I've concluded that this person is capable of doing this. But you know, the moonshots have been surprises. In fact, a very well-known professor in the business school, who used to give me some detailed evaluations of students, now would say to me when I call him, he'd say, "Of course, you know, I no longer make predictions." And it's just because it's really hard. And so you try and make the best judgments you can based on the data that's available, and then you put work in with the entrepreneur to help them be successful.
Just because of the time, why don't one of you take the search fund end of it?
The search fund?
Yeah,
To me, the critical thing is, does the person, do I think this is someone who really wants to run a small business, actually get in and wrap their arms around that, and who's going to like managing people of all different backgrounds? So for me, it's much more a negative screen. If I don't see that, or if I sense anything that tells me this guy would be much happier working for Goldman than running a business, that's a huge red flag, and we'll walk away. Guys out of the military or gals out of the military are actually a pretty good sign for us, a good favorable sign, because they have made decisions, they've led people, they've managed people, they've got people blue collar, white collar, everything. They deal with it, and that's a big plus to us. So
I'm a real softie.
Jim, very quickly on now you've got a deal, and why is your hit rate on your follow-on acquisition so much higher than the industry average, if you will? You believe?
Well, I know that the vast majority of the companies in the 22 search funds that I've been in that bought companies and have exited, they had really good corporate governance. They had one or two strong directors on their boards that took them to task at every meeting on the important issues and made sure that in the early years they focused on important things. That's one common thread. There's luck plays a role. They ended up choosing good industries. So you're talking about of the ones that worked out, that I invested in and worked out.
Yeah.
So not the ones that I avoided because I culled them out.
Right. Yeah. I think, for example, if you looked at the industries and you said, we're blind to the outcome, and you said, which of those industries just don't make sense, and you pulled them out, I think you would immediately see a huge skew to the right.
Absolutely.
So my own feeling is most of that is explained by industry. The second piece, which is a cousin of that, is explained by opportunistic search versus an industry search. And I think if you just change those two variables, you have a very different outcome for search funds. I want to just have a couple of closing remarks so that we can end on time. And first of all, we had a great opportunity here to have these three people. So could we thank them? They don't always clap, too, so. All right. In the middle of the rest of my life, I walk in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. And this is from the Divine Comedy. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark where the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say, what was this forest savage, rough and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear? So bitter it is, death is little more. But of the good to treat, which I there found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. I cannot well repeat how there I entered, so full I was of slumber at the moment in which I had abandoned the true way. But after I had reached a mountain's foot, at that point where the valley terminated, which had with consternation pierced my heart, upward I looked, and I beheld its shoulders, vested already with that planet's rays, which leadeth others right by every road. There's a temptation, I think, in human existence to base your life on contingency, to only take that first courageous step when all the conditions are perfect, when your list of criteria have been fully met. And the same can be applied for your personal criteria. I'll step into the ring after my student loans are paid off, or once I have operational experience, when the market improves, after I get the down payment on my house, after my kids get in school, after I graduate, and pretty soon everything is behind you. It's as if we could completely control the climate of our existence, get the temperature just right, only when we have a full sense of freedom, then I'll take that courageous step. But I don't think that complete control over your life and the variables in your life ever really exist in the real world. So in the middle of the rest of my life, I walk in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost.